Everyone for coming out. My name is Bob Zubrick, and I'm the Associate Director of the Gillum Center for Free Enterprise and Ethical Leadership. And today it's my great pleasure to introduce Jason Lusk. Dr. Lusk is the Regents Professor at Willard Sparks, Endowed Chair at Oklahoma State University in Agricultural Economics. Before joining the faculty at OSU, Professor Lusk taught at Purdue and Mississippi State University. He also was Associate Professor at the French National Institute for Agricultural Research in Paris. He earned his PhD from Kansas State, and his bachelor's degree is from Texas Tech. He is the author of over 100 academic articles, and he's co-authored or authored 4 books, including, make sure I get the better way, Compassion by the Pound, The Economics of Farm Animal Welfare. Today he's going to talk to us about his most recent book, The Food Police. Please welcome Professor Jason Lusk.
How are y'all doing? Good. All right, we got a lot going on. This is good. It's a real pleasure to be here and talk to you a little bit. I will start with a little bit of a warning. I've found over the years that talking about food, it's a little bit like talking about politics or religion. Everybody has a really strong opinion, and you can get yourself in hot water really fast. So hopefully I won't get under your skin too much today. We can think through some of our food choices together. And I think one of the reasons food is so controversial is that food's really personal. You know, we all eat, we all have an opinion about it, but not only is food personal, it's also really social. It's something we do with other people, but increasingly these days, food is also political. So what I want to do in the next hour or so is talk a little bit about that politics of food and the future of food and the fight for where that future is going. But I thought it would be helpful if I spent a few minutes here at the beginning letting you know where I'm coming from. Everybody has a perspective that's shaped by their past, and I have a past too. And so I don't presume you know much about me, so it might help you to know a little bit about where I'm coming from. So you might not be able to see this. This was me in 1974. I think I was destined to be an Oklahoma State Cowboy or a Texas Tech Red Raider to have my guns up even at a age. But I grew up in a very small town in West Texas. There were 12 people in my graduating class. My family did not farm, but almost everyone else I knew did. They either worked for the school or they farmed. And one of the things that meant in this small rural community is that if you're anything like my dad was, you weren't allowed to sit around the house. You had to go out and work. And my dad always seemed to have a friend or two that needed somebody to work on their farms, and so that's what I did. So every summer I spent working in neighbors' cotton fields. I also spent my time showing sheep and pigs and doing all the things that kids in rural West Texas do, raising farm animals. And I think one of the formative moments in my childhood, I can really distinctly remember working for a cotton farmer. One of the things I did was hoe cotton weeds. That job, by the way, now is obsolete thanks to biotechnology. But at the time, you had a hoe in your hand, you'd walk from one end of the field to the other and chop every weed you saw. And I can remember sitting out in the middle of one of these cotton fields that looked something like this. I remember thinking to myself, the sun's beating down on my hands. It looks like a mile to the end of the row. The day's just starting, and I'm thinking this is all the incentive I ever need to finish college. And so I had a big incentive, and that's what I did. So I have an undergrad degree in food science and technology. I have a PhD in agricultural economics. But along the way, I worked for county extension agents that planted some of the first biotech cotton in that part of Texas. I work for food processors, making salsas and jams and salad dressings for large restaurant chains. And for the last 15 years, I've been studying the economics of food. And the reason I want to tell you that is because I presume, like a lot of you, I care a lot about food. And I care a lot about agriculture. And I've spent my lifetime around the people who make the food that you and I eat. And perhaps because we all eat, but also perhaps because there's so many books about it, it seems to me that almost everybody I run into these days is an expert on food. Everybody has their favorite reason for why Americans are so fat, or why farmers are playing biotechnology, or why small animals are living in cages, and it's really hard to turn on the TV, or step on an airplane, or pick up a magazine without reading some celebrity chef or cookbook author that claims to know exactly why we have all these food problems, and also seems to know exactly the right policy solutions that will save us all. And in a lot of ways, I think it's great that there is a culture that's renewed an interest in food. I think that's a fantastic development. I think it's a really positive sign that consumers can use their wallets to get the things out of the food system that they want, and they can find entrepreneurs that provide those things that they're willing to buy. And it's even interesting that sometimes people turn to their own backyards to get the kind of food that they want. That's all fine and good, and I think it's a great development. But what I fear is that people's perspectives about food and agriculture are being formed in a way that produces a misleading picture about food and agriculture in America. I think there's a really vast underappreciation of the benefits of the food production system we have, but also the unintended consequences of a lot of food policies that people are proposing. So what I'm hoping we can do in the next few minutes is think through some of our food decisions together. And I know there's probably going to be times that many of you are going to disagree with something I say. And that's okay. We're grown-ups. And we can disagree and have an intelligent conversation about it. But I think one thing I want you to keep in the back of your mind is I care about our food system. These are my sons. This is when we lived in Paris. This was this summer at a Nationals baseball game in D.C. So I have kids. I care about their future. I care about how they eat. So I'm not some heartless defender of agribusinesses. In fact, I'm not doing that. I'm trying to think about my own kids' future and about the kind of future I want them to live in. Let's be frank, we all care about that, right? We all care about our own future. One of these days, you're going to have kids or grandkids, and you want them to grow up healthy and wise, have clean air and healthy food and a nice environment to live in. We all want that for our kids, but we can't just think about making wise decisions. Involves more than just thinking about what we put in our mouths. It also requires us thinking about what we do with our wallets. And we want to marry our concerns about the food production system with the evidence on whether the actions that you're taking actually has the kind of effects that you want, and whether the policies that are being advocated are actually going to have the effects that people say they will. So one of my colleagues at Oklahoma State, he likes to tell people that an economist's job is to inform people about alternatives and consequences. So I can't tell you what kind of future you want. That involves your own preferences, your own values, and your own judgment calls. But what I hope I can do is talk to you about some of the alternatives, at least from my perspective, and hopefully reveal at least some of the consequences of some of the alternative paths that they're being proposed. So let's start perhaps with a little bit of a description of the food problems that some of the critics of our food system say that we have. So one example is Kelly Brownell. He was, at least at one time, a professor at Yale University. He was the originator of what's now a pretty common idea, a soda tax. He called it a Twinkie tax back in the early 90s. He wrote this book a few years ago. You can see a hamburger on the front. In this book, you can read him say that you and I live in a toxic food environment. So that's one big problem. Then we have, of course, Michael Pollan, a hugely successful and influential writer. This is probably the book that really launched him on the national scene. Omnivore's Dilemma came out in about 2004, 2005, sometime in there. You don't even get a page into this book before you read that Americans have a national eating disorder. So if you're an American like I am, you say, you have a national eating disorder. Then we have people like Mark Bittman. He's a cookbook author. He also has a blog for the New York Times. And he gave a TED Talk a few years ago. You can go on YouTube and watch it now. It's been downloaded over 1 million times. And in that TED Talk, he shows a picture of a cow. And a few slides, that's another slide later, he shows a picture of an atomic bomb. And he says that our modern food production system, in particular our animal production system, is leading to, in his words, a holocaust of a different kind. So the problem, if I had to sum it up in short, it's that we're eating too much sugar, too much meat, too much processed food, too many pesticides. Agriculture is too corporate, too monoculture, too subsidized. We're too fat. We're spending too much health care, and we're living unsustainably. That, in short, is a cultural critique of food. Now, the prescription that's offered for those problems, some of those problems are real, but the prescription that's offered for those problems is local, slow, natural, organic food. And often those types of foods are encouraged by these sorts of authors and others with a healthy dose of food taxes, subsidies, and all kinds of other regulations. In many ways, you can think about this alternative that's being presented as a sort of return to nature and an abandonment of modern production agriculture. So what I want to ask is whether it's possible that a lot of what you have read about food, and perhaps some of even what you may believe about food, is wrong. Now let's face it, we humans, we're subject to all kinds of decision-making biases. We're notoriously bad at judging small risks. One example I like to give is that if I'm out working in my lawn, I'll be scared to death even if I run across the smallest little grass snake, even though I know in my mind that little snake's not going to do me much harm. It's just human nature to focus on the negative and the emotionals, especially the incentive of the news to do that. But sometimes those kind of feelings can get the better of us. It can cause us to distort reality. And so sometimes stories, for example, like the one that Pollan tells, that we're drowning in this river of cheap corn that's pesticide riddled, they're more saleable in the media and they have more of a cognitive influence on us than reports, for example, showing the effects of lower food prices on the poor. So let me give you a few examples of the kinds of things that some of our perspectives about food may become distorted relative to the objective facts on the ground. One is food pesticides. Farmers use pesticides to keep bugs away. Why do they want to keep bugs away? Well, so that they can have more commodities to sell us. It's also so that when you and I go to the grocery store, we pick that apple, that asparagus, or what have you, that it's not also eaten by bugs. So the food looks better to us as well. And, I will be frank, food pesticides are a legitimate risk. But how big of a risk is it in the grand scheme of things? We fret over the dangers of food pesticides, but if you look at the statistics, you're over 1,600 times more likely to die from a car wreck. And this sounds crazy, but even according to the statistics, 15 times more likely to die from drowning in the bathtub than you are from food pesticides. Pesticides, as I say, they are a legitimate risk, but they are a very small risk in the grand scheme of things. Another way to put it in perspective is to look at a slide like this one. This was at the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences a few years ago. And one thing these authors calculated is that 99.99% of all the pesticides that you eat, the plants make themselves. They're natural pesticides. Why do plants do that? Because they're also trying to protect themselves from bugs, right? They've evolved to want to be able to grow healthy and to keep themselves from being eaten from the things in their environment. So most of the pesticides that you're eating actually come from the food's own natural system. In fact, one estimate suggests that 3 daily cups of coffee or 1 gram of basil is 60 times as risky or as toxic as the so-called synthetic pesticides that farmers spray on crops. So yeah, you can be worried about pesticides, but you might want to put those fears in context relative to the other risks in life that you face. Let's look at another example. Almost all the cattle that are produced in the United States, 90-some-odd%, are administered some kind of growth hormones in a feedlot. Now, surely these hormones are the reason why the puberty age in girls has been falling, right? What other reasons? In fact, people don't really know why that's happening. One of probably the biggest reasons is people weigh more now, to be quite frank. But you also hear these stories about these hormones having all kinds of adverse side effects, whether it's the one I just mentioned or other things in general. But how bad is this stuff? How big is this risk in the grand scheme of things? Well, one thing to do is to kind of put it in perspective, and there's one piece of research actually was done at Oklahoma State University, and they went and looked at cattle that had been administered growth hormones. Most of these are some version of estrogen. And they compared the meat that came from those animals to those that had not been administered growth hormones. What they found was that those animals had been, if you ate a hamburger from the animals that had been given added growth hormones, you're going to eat about 3 extra nanograms of estrogen. A nanogram, by the way, is 1/billionth of a gram. Well, is 3 nanograms, is that a big or a small number? Well, if you ate the equivalent amount of soybean oil, you can eat almost 1,000,000 nanograms of estrogen. A head of cabbage would be almost 10,000 nanograms of estrogen. I suspect some of the women in the room are on birth control pills, which have over 1,000 times or nanograms of estrogen. So yeah, you might want to be worried about the extra estrogen in the beef that you eat. But if you're going to be worried about that, you might want to also be worried about a lot of other things in the foods that you eat and that you willingly put in your mouth. I'll give you one last example, and that's biotechnology. So farmers use biotechnology because it saves them labor. A job I mentioned, by the way, that I hated, that I had to hoe, that job doesn't really exist much anymore. You can go through the field and spray herbicide. It doesn't kill the toxins, but will kill the weeds. So it saves labor. It can often increase yields, help farmers get more food from the same amount of land. And although there's some debate about whether it causes more or less herbicide use, it's pretty clear it reduces insecticide use, which is the more toxic of the two. And it's pretty clear, even if it's increased herbicide use, that it's led to adoption of less environmentally damaging herbicides. So people fret about the dangers of GMOs. Is it safe to eat or not? But after almost 2 decades of eating biotech foods, they were first planted in the early 90s, there's not been a single scientifically confirmed case of illness from biotechnology. Every major scientific authority on the subject, including the American Medical Association, American Dietetic Association, our National Academy of Sciences has a report on the subject. It's not just even in the U.S., it's across the world. You can look at the World Health Organization, the United Nations Food Organization. All these studies have done significant lit reviews and have confirmed the basic safety of biotechnology. So I can understand if, for example, you don't like Monsanto. There might be some legitimate reasons for that. But to say that because of that, you don't want any biotechnology is saying, like, because you don't like Samsung, you're not going to buy any TVs. It's kind of crazy. So I think you've got to separate, on the one hand, your concerns about market power from concerns about the technology in and of itself. So I think the issue, these are just 3 examples, and I could go on. The book has other examples like that. But the issue is that when we have authors or non-government agencies, or even government agencies that require crises to either sell books, secure donations, or public funding, there's sort of a natural incentive to slant the facts on the ground, even if they're unintentional, to sort of sensationalize. And one of the problems with that is our vision of reality can sometimes be distorted, and that's particularly true in a country like ours where most people don't have a direct connection to production agriculture. How do you know whether what people are telling you in these books is true? And the trouble is that sometimes we can get distracted from the things in life that matter most. So I get worried about that little snake in the grass I was telling you about, rather than getting worried about whether my kids are running out in the middle of the street. That's a much bigger risk and a much larger consequence if something happens there. So I understand if you want to, I can understand the urge at least, if you want to avoid GMOs, growth hormones, or pesticides. And I think it's great. It's actually, I think, one of the benefits of a market economy. There are ways for you to express those preferences in the marketplace. There are people willing to sell foods without those technologies. But what I want us to also keep in mind is that it is more expensive to produce foods without those technologies. And while you might be willing to pay a premium, and while sometimes I might be willing to pay a premium to produce foods to avoid those small risks, not everybody is so fortunate. And I think we need to keep that in mind. So let's get back to this sort of overarching solution for some of the food problems that I've mentioned. As I've mentioned, this overarching solution is in many ways a return to nature. I kind of like to think about it as a sort of romantic traditionalism. And in large part, this is a movement that is a reaction against technological change in food and agriculture. You know, at our country's founding, almost everybody in the country was involved in agriculture. But modern technologies allowed our forefathers to leave the countryside, to leave that subsistence living, and pursue better opportunities in town. You know, today, less than 2%, probably more closer to about 1% of Americans make their living farming. Even though that's true, farmers are today doing financially better than they ever have been, at least in recent decades. Even though we have fewer farmers, we have a lot more food. Not only do we have more food, it's higher quality food, and it's never been safer than it ever has been before. But there is yet this view that somehow the world of food and agriculture was perfect sometime around 1950, and something really bad happened, and it would get sort of on a downhill slide. So we could just get back to that 1950s era agriculture, all would be well and good. But I want to show you a picture. This is my dad on their farm in that 1950s agriculture. I want you to think in your mind whether this picture is anything like these romantic visions of food and agriculture that you see. First of all, you'll see they didn't have a shirt on, probably doesn't have any shoes on. There's no grass, lush fields in the background. There's one cow back behind their house they had here, scrawny. There's no grass to eat. This is food and agriculture in 1950, people. There was nothing romantic about it. My dad, his parents were happy. I mean, I'm sure they weren't happy at the time to have to leave the farms, but the lives they ended up leading were far better than the lives they led during this time period. And one of the reasons those lives are so much better is because of the ability of technology to change the way that we produce food in this country. And yet, we like to look back on these times like this and think, oh, how nice that was. That's really quaint and cute. We should get back to that kind of lifestyle. But I think that's just sort of romanticism in practice. And I found a quote by John Steinbeck I thought is particularly compelling in this regard. He wrote a book called Travel with Charlie in the 1960s. He was traveling around America, making various observations. And one of the things he said in the book was this. He said, even while I protest the assembly line production of our food, our songs, and language, and eventually our souls, I know that it was a rare home to bake good bread in the old days. What he's saying there is, I like to look back with fond memories on all these great things that happened back there. But if I was going to be really honest with myself, the reality of that history was something like this. There wasn't a lot of good bread back in the old days, if I had to be honest with myself. That's at least my interpretation of what he's saying. So I think the changes that we've seen in food, a lot of people take those changes for granted. It is true that more Americans today are probably threatened by obesity than they are by starvation. But the way I look at it is that's the lesser of two evils, especially if you're poor. And just because we have enough food to eat today does not guarantee that we'll have enough food to produce enough food in the future. It's not as though you can just decide on a whim, oh, okay, we're going to, all of a sudden, if times get tough and food prices start rising, oh, we're just going to create new technologies. That's not the way it works. These agricultural technologies that we now have, like 20 years in the pipeline. People that work on estimating the effects of agricultural productivity gains, the kinds of labs they use are 20 to 30 years between the scientists working on it to the time we actually see the benefits of the consumers. So I think the importance there is that the food abundance that we have around us today, if you read books like Michael Pollan, he says what we should do is get back and work with nature. But the way I look at it, the abundance we have is not because we work with nature. It's a triumph of human ingenuity over nature's indifference to us. One way to think about it is there's nothing more natural than dying. And the fact that we have fewer people dying than we once did and living longer is because we have found a way to get around nature's indifference to us. So, disparaging modern production agriculture back in 2005, Michael Pollan in The Omnivore's Dilemma, he was writing that the corn supply was too cheap. Likewise, in about 2002, the well-known nutritionist Marion Nestle, she argued that food is too cheap in this country. And even as late as 2009, Mark Bittman, who I referred to earlier, Michael Pollan was writing that we should pay more and eat less. Pay more. And then even in 2011, Mark Bittman, he ironically wrote in the New York Times that prices for a bunch of different kinds of foods are unjustifiably low. Now I use the word ironic there because it was just the previous day that the New York Times had a headline story, and the headline of that story was food crisis. And the crisis wasn't that food prices were too low, but rather, quote, that food prices are soaring to record levels. So little did all those people know that were rising in the mid-2000s that only a few years later, in 2008, the prices for many commodities would more than double. And then they spiked again around 2011. So in the last year, food commodity prices have come down a little bit, but in 2008 and again in 2011, they were as high as they've ever been in recorded, at least recently recorded history. And indeed, this is a graph from the United Nations that constructs a food price index going back from 1990 to 2013. So you can see here's when they got to write how food's too cheap in this country. But you know they had such foresight They didn't realize that there could be a huge spike here a few years later, and then again after this. This is the World Food Price Index. And normally when food prices spike, it's not the people in this room that are probably most affected, but those people that are some of the most, or the least fortunate among us. So there's a view in which the benefits of modern technologies accrue only to these greedy agribusinesses, like fast food restaurants and corporate farms. Again, that may be partly true. I suspect that companies like Tyson and Monsanto and McDonald's and Kraft, they probably wouldn't be in business unless there's a little money to be made. But that doesn't mean we haven't benefited too. And when I look at the facts, I think, in fact, especially through the effects of food prices, we've derived a lot of benefit, mainly by, as I mentioned, lower food prices, but also more food options, more convenience. And I'm not denying that there aren't adverse consequences of our modern food production system. There are, but I also think we shouldn't forget the good that's happened. And by denying the efficiencies of a lot of these modern technologies, I think one of the problems is that in that process, we may very well be starving the very people that we say we want to help. And in our vexation over obesity, we seem to have forgotten that almost 15% of U.S. households, according to the USDA, are food insecure. That means they said they had a hard time finding enough food to eat. Past year, they didn't have enough money to buy enough food to eat. If you've been looking at any of the news recently, you'll also see that all this food insecurity has happened at the same time that we have record levels of people on food stamps in this country. But really the bigger problem is not in the United States, it's outside of the rest of the world, where they spend a much higher share of their income on food. And according to the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organizations, there's just under 1 billion people in the world starving today. And those price spikes that I have here behind me, those price spikes have the biggest effect on some of those poorest of people. So as this recent history illustrates behind me, falling food prices are not a guarantee. We've thankfully avoided this Malthusian nightmare. This is the nightmare of our population growth exceeding our capacity to supply enough food to feed that population. But as I like to say about stocks, our past performance is not a guarantee of future success, and indeed there are some reasons we might want to be a little bit worried. The economist Tyler Cowen wrote a book a couple years ago called The Great Stagnation. One of the things he argues in that book is all the low-hanging fruit's been picked. He says some of the rates of productivity growth are falling, and some of that is even true when you look at agriculture. So wheat yields, for example, have been slowing across the world at least. So one of the things I think that's important here is a lot of the books that you'll read or you'll hear discussions on food about food and agriculture, they want to talk about the morality of food. But if we're going to talk about the morality of food, I think foremost in our minds must be the ability of people, especially the poor among us, to eat. And whatever positives might be said about the new food movements and the regulations, things like the push for soda and tweaking taxes, the promotion of and subsidization of local foods, the attempts to regulate salt content in fast food, aversion and bans in biotechnology, all those things make it harder on the poorest among us to meet the most basic necessity of life, which is to eat. And some of you have probably at some point in your classes seen this Maslow's famous hierarchy of needs. You start out here and meet your physiological needs, and after that you move up and start worrying about some other things. But when I think about a lot of these modern food movements and these food that are being advocated, it's taking this Maslow's hierarchy and doing this to it. We're looking at these poor people, we say, we want you to reach self-actualization through your food choices. We don't care if you live in an inner city, we want you to eat local food in that inner city. Oh, it should be organic and all these other things too. But how can you expect people to reach that inner fulfillment through their food choices when they're just plain hungry? They haven't got to the bottom stage of that triangle. So again, you don't have to like all modern food technologies, and I think it's good, again, just being competitive, that there are ways people can avoid them. But I think we should at least recognize the consequences of some of the policies that are being advocated, especially for people that have different incomes and different preferences and different budget constraints than many of us that are sitting here in this room. And I think a large part of my critique of these modern food movements is that you have one group of people that sort of have upper middle class food preferences thinking everybody should be eating like I do. Why are they not? Why are they not willing to give up a little more of their income to have a little more of this kind of food or that kind of food? But I look at that as just a sort of elitism. I'm saying you should be like me. because what I'm like is what everybody else should be like. Okay, so I've been talking in sort of these vague generalities at this point, but what I thought would be useful, and here's where I'll probably get myself in a little bit of hot water, but I thought I'd pick a specific example. I've got a whole chapter on this in the book if you want more. But I want to talk about one of the alternatives that's being proposed as a solution to a lot of our modern food problems. It's very fashionable in a lot of modern food circles, and that's local foods. And I think it's important to pick an issue like this, or any issue in specific, because I've argued that low food prices are a benefit for consumers. I mean, it's not just a benefit to poor food consumers. I like to pay low prices too. I don't know about you. But if I'm going to be fair with people like Michael Pollan and Mark Bittman and those folks, their critique isn't just that food prices are low. Their critique is that they're too low, that they're masking all these other environmental and health consequences. So for those of you, those economists in the room, or for those students who have taken some economics, their argument is basically, although they may not say it like this, what they would say is that there are externalities in food production. And so those prices we're paying don't actually reflect all the social costs. So what we need to do is then pick one of the policies they're proposing, like advancing local foods, and ask, can that fix these externalities? Are the local foods good for the economy? Are they good for the environment? Are they good for health? And I'm not so sure. So I don't want to be misunderstood, though. So before getting into this, I want to be clear. I'm not saying don't go to your local farmer's market. I like going to the farmer's market. My former students at Oklahoma State, some of them run stands at the farmer's market in Stillwater, Oklahoma. I'm not saying that at all. In fact, I saw a guy on the road on my way up from Charlottesville this morning from the airport, the guy selling fruit and vegetable on the side of the road. I thought that was pretty tasty. So I'm not saying there's anything inherently wrong with buying local food. And again, I'm just going to show you this, the picture of my dad and my aunt, where they used to live in 1940-something. They had chickens in their backyard. This is my granddad and the hogs in their backyard. I know what local food is. They had it right outside their back door. So I'm not saying there's anything inherently wrong with local food. And indeed, why is it that you like to sometimes buy local food? Because sometimes it's fun to go to the farmer's market, right? It's a little entertaining. Sometimes you like to know the guy or gal that you're buying your food from. And sometimes it's fresher and tastier. But what I'm arguing is all those benefits are private benefits that you directly get from engaging in that activity. And so what I'm going to take issue with is, for reasons I'm going to detail in what follows, are regulations that somehow you're going to use my tax dollars to subsidize your purchase of local asparagus. That's where I'm going to draw the line. If you want to use your dollars to buy local asparagus, go for it. I think that's a great thing to do. But when you start asking me to use my tax dollars to run ads promoting local foods, or if you want to take some of Pollan's advice, several times he said what we should do is require schools or local hospitals or local jails, for example, to source a certain percentage of their food within a given radius. That's the kind of thing I'm going to take issue with. I'm also going to take issue with this sort of elitism or this sort of moralizing that buying local foods is what you should be doing, and if you're not, there's something a little suspicious about you. It's those things I'm going to take issue with. So normally when economists think about regulations, the way we approach that is to say, where's the market failure? What's the market not doing and what's preventing it that we think we could somehow fix with this regulation? And any time I've asked that question, I have yet to hear somebody give me a compelling answer. So let's look at some of the actual issues. I'm going to go through about 3 or 4 of them. So let's take the first one. Are local foods good for the environment? That seems to be often one of the most self-evident statements that people supporting local foods say. And the argument goes something like this. Well, obviously foods that's grown locally travel fewer miles, so it uses less transportation. Because there's less transportation, it took less energy and emitted fewer greenhouse gases. So of course local foods are better for the environment. But if you even scratch the surface a little bit, you'll see that argument fails to hold up. And the reasons are many-fold, but here are some of them. One of them is if you look at the actual food chain, what you'll see is that most of the energy used in the food chain occurs on the farm, where the food is being produced. In fact, some estimates say 80% of all the greenhouse gas emissions occur on the farm. So what I take that to mean is that what you want to do if you're concerned about energy use is grow that food where it can be most efficiently grown. And then ship it to where it's consumed. In fact, that shipping phase of the food process, those food miles, is often one of the smallest parts of the energy expenditures. So just to give you a couple of examples, there's one study a few years ago, I think this is one of the most striking examples. And one of the things they showed is that consumers that lived in London, if they bought land that was grown in London or near London, they would consume more energy and expend more greenhouse gases than if they bought land that was grown in New Zealand and shipped 10,000 miles to London. Now, how in the world is that possible? Well, it's because New Zealand is endowed with all those things that make rearing sheep really easy. You got lots of grass, lots of sunshine, and once you put those sheep, after they're processed, on a boat, it's incredibly energy efficient to ship by sea. You got to remember, people were sailing the ocean blue before we had fossil fuels, right? Put up the sails, you go straight across on the currents. So shipping by sea is incredibly energy efficient. Other examples, sometimes restaurants, for example, that want a year-round supply of local foods, especially in places in the north, you can't have tomatoes all year long, so what do? They have local greenhouses. I got news for you, running a greenhouse in the middle of November in New York is not an energy-efficient thing to do. You'd use a lot less energy if you grew those tomatoes down in Mexico or Florida and shipped them up than it would be to grow them in a greenhouse. And it's not just me saying that, I can point you to several research papers which show that. Moreover, you got to think about the energy emissions of the people getting to the market. That farmer's market involves lots of small farmers using lots of small old pickup trucks to get themselves to the market. And those energy expenditures, if you look at some of the research, add up to a lot more energy emission than driving a semi into the back of Walmart. Let's look at a related issue to that. That is, if you look at a lot of the farmers markets, and CSAs, that's the community supported agriculture, for example, where people buy shares in a farm. There's a lot of waste that goes on there. What happens to all that food that a farmer can't sell? There was one study that some authors did at a farmer's market. And one of the things they showed is that farmers threw away about half of the produce that they produced before they even got to market because it was not an acceptable size or it had blemishes or other things on it. Moreover, because they didn't sell a lot of the produce at the market, during the farmer's market, they had to throw a bunch of that away. Another 20 to 30% was thrown away afterwards. That kind of waste is not nearly as problematic in areas of the country where you have a lot of processing occurring at the same plant, because what you have near those plants are processing facilities that will take that produce and either freeze it or can it or process it, turn it into tomato sauce or do whatever else with it. So when you have lots of little small operators everywhere, you have a lot more of that sort of waste. Moreover, because you have all the produce in a given region coming to market at the same time, you have a glut of produce on the market in a local region. In fact, if you go on the web and you look at people that are involved in these CSAs, one of the things you'll often see is something like, well, this whole basket of kale, what do I do with kale? First of all, the person didn't know how to grow kale, but then second of all, they got a whole basket of it because it all came to market at the same time. And often, when you read a lot of those things, well, I feel guilty about it, but I ended up throwing it away. So I don't know about you, but that kind of waste is not something I would think about as somebody who's really concerned about the environment wanting to change. Okay, let's take another issue that's often touted, and that is that local foods are good for the economy. So most people, whenever this kind of argument is made, they use a so-called economic impact study to illustrate these benefits. And these studies kind of go something like this. They say, well, if you go to your local farmer's market, you spend $1 at that farmer's market, then that local farmer will take that dollar, he'll go to somebody else in town. Maybe it's somebody selling t-shirts or something in town. He spends that dollar at that t-shirt shop, and then that owner has that dollar that he goes out to eat in the restaurant in town. And that restaurant owner takes that dollar and goes back to the farmer's market and spends that dollar, creates this virtuous cycle of the dollar circulating in town. Everybody's happy and better off. And normally when these kind of arguments are made, they go something like this. They say a dollar spent, they often demonstrate this benefit by saying this through an economic multiplier. And these economic multipliers are often communicated in the following way. They say, for every $1 that's spent locally, X new jobs are created. I'm sure you probably heard something like that before. Here's my question. Where'd that dollar come from? And what else would that dollar have been spent on? And I dare say if you read any statements about that, those papers almost never answer those two questions. Often when economists do economic impact studies, that extra dollar that's creating that job is coming from outside the community. So for example, let's say, just pick something kind of crazy, let's say Nissan wants to build an automobile plant here in Harrisonburg. So it's Nissan spending these millions of dollars in town to build this manufacturing plant. So it's kind of clear there you got these extra millions of dollars coming in. It probably is going to create some jobs for this town, right? But in the case of local foods, your dollar was already here. It didn't come from somewhere else. We can't count it as a new dollar. Moreover, I think we've got to ask, what would you have spent with that dollar to begin with? We've got to calculate the opportunity cost of what that dollar would have been spent on, and it isn't all that clear to me that the highest use of that dollar was on your local tomato. But let's say I'm wrong about that. Let's say you don't buy that argument. And you think a local foods policy would benefit your local producers, your local farmers here in town. But what I want you to do is to take a step back out of that static situation and look at a more dynamic framework. Let's suppose you have a local policy here around town in Harrisonburg, and you say, we're only going to buy foods within 20 miles of here. I bet that would benefit your local farmers. Now, local consumers might be a different story. I'll get to that in a minute. But it'd probably make your local farmers a little better off. But what happens all of a sudden when Charlottesville says, now we're only going to buy food 25 miles from us? You think your local farmers are now better off? They just lost the market. So when you have all these communities pursuing inward-looking policies, saying we're only going to buy from us, it's not all that clear to me that you're any better off than you were when you began with it. All this is a very roundabout way of saying that trade is what has made us so incredibly wealthy over the past centuries. I suspect that many of you taking economics classes here at James Madison have heard something about comparative advantage, specialization, and trade, and that's what makes us so wealthy. So one last point that's good for the economy point, and that is, while I've conceded that paying more for local food might, and I say might, benefit the local farmer, it's not necessarily good for the local consumer. And in some cases, especially if we're subsidizing the purchases of local food, we're causing people to buy local foods that wouldn't have done it otherwise, and that could be like burning dollar bills. Why would we want to promote policies that take fruits and vegetables, which are often some of the most highly valued commodities for farmers, and then turn around and give them to people who value it the least? For example, kids. I showed you my two boys. They don't like to eat a lot of vegetables, and they don't care whether they're local or not. Now, I'm all for thinking about schools, trying to think about creative ways of getting them to eat a few more vegetables, and I have my ways at home. I try to get them to do it too. But simply requiring schools to buy local produce that kids won't eat isn't helpful. And it doesn't necessarily make it an economically efficient thing to do. Giving out local foods to 7-year-olds is kind of like giving out T-bones at a PETA convention. Okay, one last issue on one of the arguments given for local foods. And that is, we should promote local foods because they're healthier. We promoted local foods to help solve the obesity problem. Now, I don't doubt that a lot of us would be a little healthier if we skipped on the Big Macs. That's probably true. But I don't know what local has to do with it. You can eat unhealthy local food, or you can eat healthy foreign food. Those are two mutually distinct concepts in my mind. Now, it is true that fruits and vegetables are most nutrient-rich when they're first picked. But large growers and processors, the one I already mentioned, a lot of it will quickly freeze that produce. And when you do that, the research shows it locks in those nutrients. And indeed, if you go down the frozen vegetable aisle at Walmart or whatever grocery store you might have here, the nutrient content of those fruits and vegetables is often going to be as high or higher than fresh picked produce that's been sitting out for 2 or 3 days. And indeed, a lot of research suggests that canned fruits and vegetables can be better than fresh picked that's been sitting out for 4 or 5 days. And I've already mentioned some of those, the community-supported ag, or the fact that a lot of farmers can't sell their produce immediately fresh picked. So some of the stuff you're often buying has been sitting out for a while. So I think we don't want to just turn our backs on the technologies that we have, freezing and canning, which do preserve a lot of nutrients. In fact, one group of scientists concluded in one of their studies that was published that, quote, the exclusive recommendations of fresh produce ignore the nutrient benefits of canned and frozen produce. Moreover, I would say eating healthy, it means more than just eating a few kinds of fruits and vegetables. And indeed, one of the key components of a healthy diet is diversity in your diet, like eating a lot of different things. But someone who restricts their diet to only those things that can be grown locally is somebody who's restricting diversity in their diet. It may not be true if you live in California, and it may not be true in Virginia, but I can guarantee it's true in Oklahoma, especially in the winter. And yet, if you walk in almost any grocery store, even in a small town like the one you live in, at any time of year, you'll see some of the most amazing diversity of food that human history has ever witnessed. I can go in Walmart in Stillwater, Oklahoma, and find a jalapeno any time of year. Cilantro, peppers, tomatoes, oranges, cucumbers, any day, any time of year, midnight, 10 a.m. in the morning, it doesn't matter. And that incredible diversity, that cornucopia that we have available to us is because we trade with other people. So I'm not against you going to the local farmer's market. I'm not against you buying local food. I think those things are great. You ought to do it. But I am going to urge caution in pursuing policies that require or subsidize local food production and consumption. Local food systems are an alternative to our modern food production system, but I'm not all that convinced they meaningfully deal with any of those externalities that have been mentioned. So let me kind of start wrapping up, and maybe I'll do that on a little bit more of a positive note. So I've argued that there's a lot of good about food and agriculture in this country, and I think it's important to bring that back to the forefront and to recognize that fact as a starting point for thinking about the future of food. So let me just briefly tell you about some of the positive things about food and agriculture in this country. One is that we have a lot more leisure time. So cooking and cleaning has got a lot more convenient, and it's a lot easier. So today, compared to the 1960s, according to time use surveys, women that work at home, they spend 40% less time in food preparation and 81% less time in field cleanup. Now, Michael Pollan has a new book now. It's called Cook. He said, well, I'll get back to the kitchen. I think if you want to do that, that's great. But if you think this lifestyle looks good, you might notice there's no microwave, there's no dishwasher, there's no man. And thinking back to this lifestyle is something that we want to aspire to. I think it's a bit of, again, romantic foolishness. And indeed, if this change in the time use doesn't sound good to you, I encourage you to talk to your grandmother. Because many of our grandmothers spent many hours a day just simply trying to get food on the table and to clean up after. Today, there's a lot more money in your pocket because of our food production system. One statistic suggests that it took a school teacher in 1900 more than an hour's worth of work to earn enough to buy a dozen eggs. Today, a school teacher has to work less than 3 minutes to buy that same dozen eggs. It's not because teachers are paid more, it's because eggs are less expensive. Food is more affordable in the United States than anywhere else in the world. Americans spend half as much of our income on food as the Germans, the French, the Italians. We even spend a third as much as our Mexican neighbors. Today, we spend less than 10% of our disposable income on food. Now, I know there are some that say, well, that's a problem. We should be spending more. Well, that statistic says to me that leaves 90% of our income for all the other things in life that we enjoy, like art, baseball, Disneyland, iPhones, computers, baseball games, and everything else in life that we enjoy, because we only have to spend such a small percentage of our income on food. We also have the luxury of eating out. I'm not that old, but even when I was a child, it was a rare treat to eat out. With my kids, if they don't eat out 2 or 3 times a week, they think there's some travesty. In the 1970s, only about 28% of our food, the nation's food budget was spent eating out. Today, it's almost half, a little less than half, about 43%. You might think, well, that's not a big deal getting to eat out. That's actually amazing. You're getting somebody to wait on you, to bring you food, to cook and clean up after you. That is amazing development if you think about it. And despite whatever you may believe or have been told, we're actually eating more fruits and vegetables. So compared to the 1970s, consumption of fruits and vegetables has increased from 20 to 30%. Our food is safer today than it ever has been. Here's one little chart that shows the number of laboratory confirmed infections from E. coli, which are down. There's one little chart that's up from a bacteria called Vibrio. That's a very, very small percentage of food contaminations. I also showed this with my grandfather. It's how they used to get their beef when they killed it. He hung it up on a tree outside of his house. So that's one reason we have less foodborne illness. We know a little better than we did, but it's also because we have food processing companies that have a reputation on the line, that can be sued, that are going to go bankrupt if they make you sick. And that's a really strong incentive to make sure that they don't. Doesn't mean it never happens. It doesn't mean there aren't tragedies when it does, but it does mean there's a huge financial incentive to make sure that we're providing safe food. We're also living longer too. So despite all you hear about rising obesity rates and whatever else it is you may hear, you got to keep in mind, how is it that we're living longer? In 1900, average life expectancy in the U.S. was 47 years old. In 1970, it was about 70 years old, and the baby born today can expect to live to about 78. Now, we live longer in part because we have better medical technologies, but we also live better, too, because we have access to more abundant, diverse, and nutritious food supplies. We also have more productive farmers, so science and innovation has allowed farmers to reap a lot more food from the same amount of land using a lot fewer inputs. So in the last 100 years, the average amount of corn, for example, produced per acre is more than quadrupled. It's increased over 400%. Wheat yields have increased about 280%. Even if you pick really obscure commodities like flaxseed, it's increased 270% over that 100-year period. It's not just this huge swath of time. If you look back just in the last 20 years, corn yields have increased 30%, wheat yields 17%, soybean yields 28%. The amazing thing is if you look at the data, all that's happened while we've been putting less land in production. So if you care about the environment, I'd say that's a really positive benefit. We've got a whole lot more food and we're farming a lot less land. And we're also using a whole lot less labor, too. Farmers today are using a lot fewer insecticides than they once did, and the insecticides they are using are much less toxic. Farmers are also more financially secure. I know there's this view that a lot of people have that say, well, corporate farms are overtaking agriculture. But if you look at the USDA data, 98% of all farms in this country are family farms. And there are more farms today than there were a decade ago. Moreover, the income on those farms is higher than it was a decade ago. It used to be, as I've just shown you with the pictures in the background, that farming was a profession of paupers, poor people. But today, that median income of farmer is far outpaces that of the median income of other U.S. households. And income isn't even really the main issue. If you look at the assets of farmers, farmers have many more assets, land, tractors, other kinds of capital, many times more than the average household income. And of course, we have a lot more choice. 100 years ago, many households were constrained to eat only what they could grow on their farm. But now we have opportunities to find flavors, textures, particularly suited to our own palates. And you don't have to take my word for it. It's a quote from a USDA publication a few years ago. And they said, there's no doubt that the food system delivers more nutritious food with wider variety, improved safety, less environmental impacts, and greater convenience than at any time in our nation's history. So just to wrap up, one of the things I want to do in giving a talk like this is, I know you're confronted with a lot of different views on how to think about food and agriculture. I'm not saying all those are necessarily wrong, and I'm not saying that some of the people who critique our modern conventional food system are totally wrong. They have valid points sometimes. But what I am trying to do is also open up alternative, acceptable ways for thinking about the future of our food system. And I think, from my perspective, a danger that's embedded in the worldview of this popular alternative is this romanticism of nature in the past. Modern, technologically advanced food is being rejected in favor of older, slower, more natural food. And I think this mindset is potentially destructive because what we think about the future affects not only who we are, but who we become. So we like to travel to places like Rome and Athens because we admire who they were and what they did, but seldom do we look at those places and think that's who we should become. And according to the economist Deidre McCloskey, who I gave a talk here not too long ago, one of the reasons we're so incredibly wealthy today is not so much because of the Industrial Revolution and capitalism per se, but rather because there was a shift in how people began to think about things like commercialism and private property, innovation, and trade. So aspirations are more than just wishes. They affect the kinds of people we become and the kind of future that we will experience. I think a worldview that celebrates naturalism as a core tenet is one that's inherently hostile to innovation and growth, even if that innovation and growth can improve through safety, through quality, and improve environmental outcomes. There's a call to reduce biotechnology, irradiation, cloning, synthetic fertilizers, even pasteurization, and all kinds of other mechanization in food and agriculture. And I'm going to admit, each one of those developments have potential downsides and have potential risks. But they also have the ability to make food more abundant, more convenient, more consistent, and less reliant on input use. And sometimes more environmentally friendly. And what I'm worried about is that generation of children, my kids that I showed you, that might be unwilling or unable to think about how to improve our diets by using mathematics and chemistry and biology and physics and engineering. When I think about the future, I don't want one where my kids are thinking about how to grow the oldest heirloom tomato or find the oldest heritage chicken they can grow on their farm, but rather I want one where they're dreaming about how to get corn to grow its own fertilizer, or how to create higher yielding, more nutritious foods that can be grown in some of the most impoverished countries in the world, and even developing space-age technologies that produce food at the touch of a button. Because my age, I used to like Star Trek. And those dreams, they may never materialize, but you can bet they're not going to materialize if we create a culture in which we can't even imagine them to exist. So I think we seem to have forgotten some of the benefits of our modern production food system. It's not a great system. It's got some downsides. But what's the alternative? For the majority of human history, the biggest problem for humans was finding enough to eat. And in many ways, if you look at our food culture around us, we are living in one of the greatest, most prosperous food environments that human history has ever witnessed. So I'm personally rationally optimistic about the future of food. And my hope is in the dynamism and innovativeness of entrepreneurs and farmers and grocers creating and trying to sell us things that we don't yet know we even want. And I say let's get out of their way. That's all I have.
Questions?
Any tomatoes to grow?
I'm interested, Jason, in using the words food and race. What is your vision for the future in the ability of the food industry to police itself, and where might intervention best be made?
Yeah, that is a good question. So one of the things I'm trying to do here, obviously, I think, is get people to recognize some of the policing mechanisms that exist within the food system. Those things involve reputation. They involve, as I say, if you look at a country like McDonald's, a company like McDonald's, they're scared to death of a food recall. And they're doing everything in their power to make sure they don't have a food recall or some bad adverse quality event happen because of the profit incentive. So in part, that's some of the things I'm trying to do is get people to appreciate the benefits of those market incentives. And some of those incentives that I'm bringing out here are things like the benefits of specialization, comparative advantage, and trade. That seems kind of obvious to maybe economists, but when you read in the food, the kind of cultural food literature, those things are totally dismissed as having any benefit at all. So, are there things that, one way to maybe think about your question a little bit, I think, is what is a proper role for government, perhaps, in the food system? And to the extent there are legitimate externalities, I think there might be one of be able to think about creative ways to do that. And I think sometimes the things people call externalities in the food movement are not really externalities. And they often don't think about the ability of sort of co-seeing solutions to work out some of those externalities. But the areas where I see potential externalities that might have some intervention for, that might have some place for a government role, are things like non-point source pollution. So if you have farmers polluting upstream, we don't know who did it, and it's having some downstream effects. It seems like some coordination mechanism there makes some sense. I don't know exactly what those mechanisms are, but partly I'm asking, and part of my critique here with a lot of food, what I'm calling food policy, is let's not just advocate policy before actually sitting down and doing the cost benefit analysis. And when I look at a lot of policies, like say the fat taxes, what you do when you look at those policies is that they have very trivial effects and really large costs. So I'm not going to claim to know which policies are going to pass a cost benefit test, pass a cost benefit test. But what I am saying is that let's at least make sure we do them. And let's talk to the economists before we promote them. So.
This is a little bit of a side that has to do with some people that have read the book and discussed it. But if you did actually bring it up at one point, in fact, I want to say at the point where you brought it up, I agree with this one, which is that this really has to do with the school childhood. So I would agree with this point that you've made specifically that it's not good public policy to be encouraging or spending money on making kids at school more. I can agree with that. But I want to raise the question of what, basic question for a couple things. Let me back up. So I completely agree that we don't want to have food police. We don't want to have adults. They're little groups. Idea, right, people bring big coats or something of this kind. People, adults ought to be free to get fat, get obese, and drag on if they want. And so on. And our life expectancy is all that great from 37, 50, 60 countries. We have more car deaths and we have more gun deaths, but we smoke less. So we're a little better on that. But I think Mexico just has some big people. We're number 2. And I'm really getting back to adults. That's one thing. They make rational decisions. But we do appear that we have a childhood obesity problem. And we don't really think I'm going to say that that's what journalism shall we say. Parents, somebody coming in and saying, okay, we should make an epidemic because these are vegetable foods or whatever. What is your, I in your book, I never really kind of found you coming down and thinking, like, wow, this doesn't work, this doesn't work. What's your solution to the childhood obesity problem and school legislation?
It's not intellectually satisfying, but I don't have one. But what I am trying to say is it's not helpful to pass policies that aren't going to do any good. We just increase costs without any creating, countervailing benefit. And so I think that's part of my critique here is, and maybe that doesn't come through as well as it should, but yeah, there's a real problem. But let's be real about the solutions and the effects that they'll have as a consequence. We can't just be motivated by good intentions. We also got to be motivated by the consequences of things we pursue. So I think one of the challenges, so I gave a talk last week to a group full of public health experts and nutritionists, and I'm going to say this will probably make some of them mad, but they don't have a clue what causes obesity either. Now, one of them will say they feel that they do, but then you go to somebody else who's a slightly different specialist, and they'll say their answer is a little different. So it's just a terribly complex problem, and I don't think we have a really good idea what's causing it. And when you look at a lot of the research that's been done on sort of school interventions, they tend to not be very effective. But I will agree with you for sure. While I certainly railed against paternalism with adults, paternalism is certainly, I think, more acceptable among children. I'm a paternalist with my children. I don't let them eat everything they want to. Now, how far we want to go in that in a public school system, I'm not sure. I think parents do have some role. Now, not all children can choose their parents. They might be in an environment that's not fair or that we want to intervene in somehow. All those are messy issues. But at least for those children that live in a quote-unquote reasonably good home, I think about the incentives in my household, and the incentives are with me to make sure that my kids have a healthy and prosperous future. But I don't quite frankly know what the answer is. I think one of the kinds of things I would want to look at are adding a little more flexibility. So I think one of the problems with schools in general is you got a lot of onerous regulations without a lot of competition. And so one of the things I think we know is that in the marketplace, one of the things that makes firms do better and provide better service and better quality is the fact that they might lose business to somebody else, and schools don't have that incentive. And that's both a problem with the educational part of it, but also part of the problem with the food part of it as well too. Those school lunchroom cafeterias, they might be, we might want to put some constraints on what they're doing, but that's all we do now. We just give a constraint. You have to put 2 fruits and vegetables on that plate. But there's no incentive for that school to make sure those fruits and vegetables really get eaten, or that they actually are given things that the students want to eat, because they sort of have a captive audience. So, I'm going to just be honest, and I think that's one of the things I'm trying to critique with the food police, is that when I don't know, I'm going to tell you I don't know, and I don't know the answer to it. And all I'm asking for people to say they know is to, when you're going to start spending my tax dollars to try something out, that you have a little bit of evidence that it's going to work, or at least let's fund it. Let's fund some research to suggest it works before you start proposing national policy solutions. So I guess part of what I'm advocating is a little bit more humility in what we actually know can work and won't work. Yes, ma'am.
Do you have policies that provide, I guess, more information on food, like lower cost of ingredients, calories? Do you think those are paternalistic or more beneficial, or do you think that the market could use that?
That's a very good question. So when I think about this question of, what's a proper role for government, one way I kind of think about it is, I think Milton Friedman said this one of the government, I think about a good role for the government as being a referee. They're not in the game, they're telling you what the rules are, they're making sure people know what the rules are, and they're going to enforce contracts and private property. So I think it's a perfectly legitimate role for the government to for example, communicate what science says, convey information. They can tell you that eating trans fats is probably going to increase your risk of a heart attack. I'm not telling you you can't eat that donut, but at least I'm going to tell you as a referee, if you do that, it's going to increase your likelihood to do that. That's a subtle distinction, but I think it's an important one. It's not one that often, people sort of don't often make that distinction. Now, I think the trouble sometimes is, let's take an issue like should genetically modified foods be labeled? That's a particularly controversial issue, and this is one that's kind of hard, I think. Is this an issue that the government is just being a referee? What's the harm in telling people whether this food has GMOs in it or not? Or is this something that, for example, in this case, I think there is an incentive for companies. If people really don't want this attribute, I got a really big incentive to provide something on the market. Organic, for example, is certified to be produced without GMOs. Or, either process that doesn't have GMOs. So, in a way, the market could provide that. But that particular issue, I think, is kind of a tricky one, because what are the issues in which we want to allow the government to essentially compel speech, to make a company say something? And at least in my mind, those areas would probably want to be things where there's a legitimate health and safety risk. So I mentioned trans fats. That's one I think where the research pretty clearly shows that if you eat too many trans fats, there's going to be a legitimate health risk. And so by the government coming in and saying, okay, we're going to require this label, I know there would be maybe other libertarian people who might agree with me, but to me, that doesn't give me all riled up if the government does that. But at least in the case of biotechnology, I know there are people that would disagree, but I mentioned that long list of scientific organizations that said there's basically no safety risk. So for the government to then come in and then mandate that, to me seems a little dubious. In part because by adding that label, one of the things that they could be doing is in effect sending a signal that there is something wrong with this, when in fact the scientific literature suggests there's not. So I think that's one of those issues that I think compelling arguments are made on either side of that argument, but that's one of those information arguments that's kind of hard to know where to fall on that particular line. But I think the way you ask the question is also important to realize that companies do have an incentive also to provide information. There's a couple of really good papers from the early 90s that showed that there's actually the government removal of bans on product claims in food that created a lot of innovation. So, for example, low fat or reduced cholesterol. The government used to ban companies to be able to make claims like that. But once they removed those bans, then you saw a lot more innovation in the food sector, according to some of those companies. So we got to appreciate that whenever we as consumers really want something, there will be an incentive for companies to provide it, and that can include information.
I planted an organic garden last year. I think I got a strawberry, 3 tomatoes out of it. It's not good. I did manage a 180-acre farm in which the profitability of the farm has been dropping steadily each year. Modern techniques have gone from planting standard corn crop to genetically modified to Roundup ready to seeds, kernels wrapped in fungicides, and now the person I hired wears a biohazard suit to load the grain or to feed into the seeds into the tractor. So still made about $18,000 last year, which is a consistent drop over time. The only people who seem to be making money are the seed companies, of which they are very big now, and control the market with a handful of companies. 2 questions. One, do you have any ties financially with those companies? And second, what's your vision of those roles that they're going to have and how they dominate the entire market?
Okay, good question. So you can go on my blog. I think that question you asked is one of the most common questions I get. So you can search, do I work for Monsanto? And the question is no. So I've never taken any money from Monsanto or any of the other big, seed biopharmaceutical companies. Fair question, though. Is there market power in the seed sector? My reading of the literature suggests, yeah, there's probably some. Those companies are extracting some monopoly rents from that sector. I think that's true. The question that I want to look at is whether anybody else has also benefited, and I think when you look at the research, it does seem to say yes. So food prices have come down as a result of things like biotechnology, and some of those benefits are shared with farmers. They wouldn't be shared as much as they would be if there wasn't market power in that sector. So yeah, I think, I don't have any problem with somebody who has some concerns about market power issues in that sector. The thing that I do worry a little bit about, though, is if we decide, or the government decides, we want really onerous regulations in that sector, does that destroy the incentive to innovate? One of the reasons Monsanto is reaping some of the profits now is because for many years, when they weren't selling those seeds, they were investing millions of dollars, probably billions of dollars, in developing those technologies and those seeds that are now in the marketplace. So I think we want to be careful about letting people who make investments in new technologies reap some of those benefits from doing so. And indeed, that's why we have patents. So, for example, like Monsanto Roundup went off patent. So they sort of lost their monopoly rents in that regard. But I wouldn't say that's a crazy concern. My own personal view is I'm much more interested or much more concerned about some of the dynamics of the incentives to invest in research and agriculture in the future if you come in and quelch some of the sort of bigger things, the bigger companies that went about. One way to also think about that too is, are these companies big because they created barriers to entry, or are they big because they earned that profit? And I think that's kind of tough. And to the extent these companies are using their power to create barriers to entry, to prevent competition, or to enact laws to keep other people from competing with them, I think that is a problem. But to the extent they're offering products that farmers actually want to buy because it's a superior product, I don't have any problem with that at all. And indeed, most of the farmers I talk to, and if you look at, I think this is an important point, if you look at every major farm commodity organization, whether it's the National Cotton Council, or the corn growers, or the American Farm Bureau, those people are huge proponents of biotechnology. Those are not people that are bought off by Monsanto. My reading of that is these farmers really like the technology that this company has created, and they're willingly adopting it. Do they wish they didn't have to pay as much for it? You betcha. But that doesn't mean they didn't wish they didn't have it. But it is a good question.
Okay, that'll have to be the last question. Thank you again for coming.